There's something that keeps showing up in stories people tell about transformation. 3 days, not two, not four, three. Someone goes into the wilderness for 3 days. They're lost for 3 days. They're in the belly of the whale for 3 days. They're dead for 3 days. And then something changes. It's such a common pattern that we barely notice it anymore. It's just how stories work. How long the hero is gone. How long the ordeal lasts. How long between death and return. 3 days. And if you start paying attention, you see it everywhere. In religious texts, in fairy tales, in the structure of rituals, in the way people describe personal crises. I was in the hospital for 3 days before I knew I'd survive. We didn't speak for 3 days after the fight. It took 3 days before I could think clearly again. Not 3.5, not roughly 3. Exactly 3. As if that's the precise amount of time transformation requires. Which raises a question that feels simple at first, but keeps opening up. Why 3 days? What is it about this specific duration that makes it feel like the right amount of time for something fundamental to change? Before we go further, if you're enjoying this, consider subscribing to Belief Explained Simply. We explore questions like this without rushing to conclusions. And if someone you know might appreciate this kind of conversation, share it with them. All right, let's continue. Let's start with the most famous 3 days. In Christianity, Jesus is crucified on Friday, lies in the tomb through Saturday, and rises on Sunday morning. 3 days. This isn't incidental, it's central. The 3 days in the tomb are what make the resurrection meaningful. Too short, and it might have been a mistake. Too long, and something would be different. Wrong. 3 days is the amount of time that makes death certain and resurrection impossible, which is what makes resurrection miraculous. But here's what's interesting. The 3-day pattern doesn't start with Christianity. In the Hebrew Bible, Jonah is in the belly of the great fish for 3 days and 3 nights before being vomited onto dry land. Esther asks the Jewish people to fast for 3 days before she approaches the king to save her people. The Israelites travel for 3 days into the wilderness before Moses can lead them to meet God at Sinai. 3 days marks the boundary between the ordinary world and the place where encounters with the divine become possible. In Islamic tradition, there are 3 days of mourning after most deaths. 3 days when the community gathers, when normal life pauses, when the transition from life to death is formally marked. In Zoroastrianism, the soul remains near the body for 3 days after death before beginning its journey to judgment. In ancient Greek religion, mystery rites often involved 3-day initiations. 3 days of fasting, ritual, and transformation before you could be considered truly initiated. Different traditions, different theologies, different contexts, same duration. Now you might think, well, 3 is just a significant number, sacred geometry, numerology, symbolism, and that's part of it. But it doesn't explain why 3 days specifically. Why not 3 hours, 3 months, 3 years? What is it about the span of 3 sunrises and sunsets that makes it feel like the right container for transformation? Here's where it starts to feel strange. 3 days is roughly how long it takes for a human body to show clear signs of death. Not immediate death, but irreversible death. In the ancient world, before modern medicine, people were sometimes mistaken for dead when they'd actually fainted, or gone into a coma, or experienced some other temporary cessation. So there were waiting periods, times when you'd watch the body to make sure the person was truly gone, and by the 3rd day, there was no mistaking it anymore. Rigor mortis would have set in and passed. Decomposition would have begun. In hot climates, the smell would be unmistakable. 3 days was long enough to be certain, which means that when religious texts say someone was dead for 3 days, they're saying this wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a near-death experience. This was actual, complete, irreversible death, and then they came back anyway. The 3 days makes the miracle more miraculous, the transformation more complete, the death more real, which makes the resurrection more impossible. But there's another layer. 3 days is also about how long a human can survive without water, not comfortably, not easily, but survive. In desert traditions, and so many religious traditions emerged from desert environments, 3 days was the boundary between survival and death. You could walk into the wilderness for 3 days and still come back, go further, and you probably wouldn't return. So 3 days in the wilderness isn't arbitrary. It's the maximum distance you can go and still come back alive. Which means when Moses leads people 3 days into the desert, or Jesus goes into the wilderness for 40 days after 3 days of preparation, or someone fasts for 3 days, they're going to the edge, the boundary between life and death. Between the habitable world and the uninhabitable beyond, 3 days is liminal, it's threshold time. There's something else about 3 days. It's long enough to break a pattern, but not so long that you've started a new one. If you stop doing something for one day, you might just be taking a break. If you stop for a week, you've begun a new routine. But 3 days? 3 days is disruption without replacement. Old pattern broken. New pattern not yet established. You're in between. And that in-between space is where transformation happens. Not immediately, not eventually, but in that specific window when you're no longer who you were, but not yet who you're becoming. Let's look at how this shows up in ritual. In many indigenous traditions, vision quests last 3 days. You go alone into the wilderness. You fast, you stay awake, or you sleep in unfamiliar ways. You wait. And on the third day, or at the end of the third night, the vision comes. Not before, not after. On the third day, there's a Jewish tradition called a 3-day wedding. Not the ceremony itself, but the celebration. 3 days of feasting, dancing, communal joy. Why 3 days? Because one day feels insufficient for the magnitude of the transition. Marriage isn't just an event, it's a threshold, a death of one identity and birth of another. And 3 days is how long it takes to fully mark that passage. In Buddhism, there's a common practice of 3-day meditation retreats. Not 2 days, not a week, 3 days. Long enough to break your normal mental patterns, short enough that you haven't just created new ones. 3 days of sitting with what arises when you stop running. Here's what I keep noticing. 3 days isn't long enough to heal. If you're sick, 3 days might be when the fever breaks, but you're not recovered. You're still weak, still vulnerable. If you're grieving, 3 days is when the shock starts to wear off and the real grief begins. If you're in crisis, 3 days is when you realize this isn't temporary, but you haven't yet figured out what to do about it. 3 days is the point where you've crossed a threshold but haven't reached the other side. You're in the middle, the liminal space. And maybe that's why it's sacred. There's a story structure that appears in fairy tales across cultures. The hero is given 3 days to complete an impossible task. Spin straw into gold in 3 days. Find the princess in 3 days. Solve the riddle in 3 days. Always 3. And always, the breakthrough comes on the third day, on the third night, at the last possible moment. Not because of narrative convenience, though it is convenient, but because 3 days is the amount of time it takes to exhaust your own resources. On the first day, you try what you know. On the second day, you try harder, but you're still working within your existing framework. On the third day, you've run out of your own solutions. You've hit the limit of what you can do alone, and that's when help arrives. When transformation becomes possible. When the impossible happens. Because 3 days is long enough to bring you to the end of yourself. In medieval Christian mysticism, there's a concept called the 3 days of darkness. It appears in the writings of mystics describing the spiritual journey. After a period of consolation, of feeling close to God, there comes a darkness, an absence, a silence, and it lasts 3 days. Not literal days necessarily, but a period that feels like 3 days, that has the quality of 3 days, long enough to panic, long enough to despair, long enough to think the light will never return, but not so long that you forget what light felt like. And then on the third day or after the 3 days, the presence returns, changed, deeper, more real than before, but only after the 3 days of absence. Here's something medical that's worth noticing. In traditional medicine, in many cultures, not just one, 3 days is often cited as the turning point in illness. If the fever doesn't break in 3 days, if the wound isn't healing after 3 days, if they're not better in 3 days, we need to try something else. 3 days is when you know whether the body is going to recover on its own or not. It's the natural timeline of acute illness. Long enough for the immune system to mount a response, long enough to know if that response is working. So when religious texts say someone was sick for 3 days before being healed, they're not picking a random number. They're saying, This person was at the turning point, the moment when recovery becomes possible or death becomes likely. The healing at 3 days is healing at the threshold. Let's think about what 3 days feels like. If you've ever been in crisis, real crisis, the kind that breaks your normal functioning, 3 days is how long you can run on adrenaline. 3 days you can stay awake, push through, operate in emergency mode. After 3 days you crash, you have to sleep, you have to stop. Your body won't let you continue in emergency mode anymore. So 3 days is the limit of acute crisis response, which means that if you survive 3 days of something terrible, you've made it through the acute phase. You're not safe yet. You're not healed, but you've survived the most dangerous part. You've crossed the threshold. There's a pattern in personal testimonies I keep noticing. When people describe spiritual experiences or psychological breakthroughs or moments of profound change, they often mention 3 days. I was in the darkness for 3 days. I couldn't eat for 3 days. I didn't sleep for 3 days. And then something shifted. Not gradually, suddenly, on the third day or at the end of the third night or right after the 3 days ended. Now, I don't know if this is because 3 days is actually how long transformation takes, or if it's because we've been shaped by stories that say 3 days is how long transformation takes, so we unconsciously structure our experiences that way. Or if 3 days is just long enough to take something seriously, but short enough to endure. Maybe all of the above, but the pattern is there. In Greek mythology, Persephone eats pomegranate seeds in the underworld. Different versions of the myth give different numbers of seeds, sometimes 3, sometimes 6, sometimes more. But the consequence is always the same. She must return to the underworld for a portion of each year. And in some versions, she's in the underworld for 3 days out of every lunar cycle. 3 days of darkness. 3 days when she's not in the world of the living, and then she returns. The cycle of 3 days of absence and return, repeated endlessly, death and resurrection as a rhythm, not a single event. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. If 3 days is the amount of time that makes death certain and resurrection miraculous, what does it mean that we keep telling stories about 3-day resurrections? Are we describing something we believe happened? Or are we describing something we need to believe can happen? Maybe the 3-day pattern isn't about historical events at all. Maybe it's about the structure of hope. Because 3 days is long enough to lose hope, but not so long that you've forgotten what hope felt like. 3 days is long enough for death to be real, but not so long that life is unimaginable. 3 days is the maximum duration of despair that still allows for resurrection. Any longer, and we'd stop waiting. Any shorter, and the resurrection wouldn't feel necessary. In fairy tales, there's often a prohibition. Don't open the door for 3 days. Don't speak for 3 days. Don't look back for 3 days. And the person always breaks the prohibition on the third day, right at the threshold. Right when they've almost made it. Why? Because 3 days is the limit of human endurance of uncertainty. We can hold tension for 3 days. We can resist temptation for 3 days. We can live with not knowing for 3 days. But on the third day, we break. We open the door. We speak. We look back. Not because we're weak, but because 3 days is the natural limit of suspended animation. 3 days is how long we can hold our breath, metaphorically speaking. After that, we have to exhale. We have to act. We have to resolve the tension, even if it costs us everything. There's a practice in some monastic traditions called the 3-day watch. When someone is dying, the community maintains a vigil for 3 days, praying, chanting, sitting with the dying person not for 1 day, not for a week, for 3 days. And often people who are dying will hang on for 3 days, even when it seems impossible, as if 3 days is the amount of time needed for the soul to prepare for departure, for the body to fully release, for the community to begin the process of letting go. After 3 days, death comes, not always, but often enough that the pattern is noticed. 3 days is the duration of the threshold between life and death. Let's come back to something personal. If you've ever had your heart broken, really broken, not just disappointed, you know what the first 3 days feel like. Shock, disbelief, operating on autopilot. After 3 days, the reality starts to sink in. This is real. This isn't temporary. This is the new world. If you've ever quit an addiction, 3 days is when the physical withdrawal peaks. 3 days is when you realize you can't go back to who you were, but you don't yet know who you're becoming. If you've ever been lost, literally lost, in wilderness or in a foreign city, 3 days is when you shift from "I'll find my way" to "I need help." 3 days is when independence becomes desperation, when self-reliance becomes surrender. Here's what I keep turning over. 3 days appears in religious texts not because ancient people were obsessed with the number 3, but because 3 days is a real thing. It's the duration of certain biological processes, the limit of certain human capacities, the boundary of certain thresholds. 3 days is how long bodies take to show irreversible death. 3 days is how long humans can survive without water. 3 days is how long we can run on adrenaline before crashing. 3 days is how long we can hold tension before we break. Religious stories use 3 days not arbitrarily, but because 3 days is already meaningful. It's written into our biology, our psychology, our experience of crisis and transformation. The stories didn't create the significance, they recognized it. But here's the deeper question. If 3 days is the natural duration of threshold time, what happens when we don't give ourselves 3 days anymore, when we expect immediate transformation, instant healing? Same-day resurrection, when we're disappointed if grief doesn't resolve in 3 hours, let alone 3 days. When we think changes should happen as fast as we can download in a poor stream of video. What do we lose when we rush through the 3 days? Maybe the 3-day pattern is our reminder. That transformation isn't instant. That death has to be real before resurrection is meaningful. That you have to go far enough into the wilderness that you can't easily turn back. That you have to sit with impossibility long enough to exhaust your own resources. That the darkness has to last long enough that you stop trying to manufacture your own light. 3 days isn't mystical because it's magic. It's mystical because it's true. It's the amount of time that bridges the before and after. The amount of time that contains both death and the possibility of return. The amount of time that's long enough to be real but short enough to endure. So when ancient texts say 3 days, maybe they're not being symbolic or poetic or numerological. Maybe they're being precise. 3 days is how long transformation takes, has always taken, will always take. You can't rush it, you can't skip it, you can't optimize it. You have to go through the 3 days into the belly of the whale, into the tomb, into the wilderness, into the darkness, and wait, not knowing if you'll emerge, not knowing if resurrection is possible, just waiting for 3 days. And on the 3rd day, maybe something changes. If this brought up something for you, a thought, a question, maybe even a disagreement, I'd love to hear it in the comments. Not looking for answers, just what this made you think about. I read every one. And if this was worth your time, please subscribe, like, and share. It really helps us keep making these. Thanks for watching.